Have you memorized this saying? Spring forward and fall back. It's an old saying that lets Americans know which way to turn their clocks to accommodate daylight savings time. To help us appreciate why most of the countries of the world follow a coordinated time zone system, let's take a look at the top 5 facts about time and time zones. Number 5. It is possible to time travel by one day. Number 4. Midnight is always somewhere on the planet. It never disappears, even for a second. Number 3. Midnight and time travel west across the Earth's surface. Number 2. If it is Tuesday in California, it is Wednesday in Japan. And number 1. The Earth has 24 time zones because that's how long it takes the Earth to rotate on its axis. Today on The Vantage Point, we're going to explore why those 5 facts about time and time zones are important. I hope you'll join us. I've always enjoyed living within a few miles of a boundary. As a kid in Detroit, I often rode my bike to Springwell's Bridge over I-75. From that lofty place, I could see Windsor, Ontario. That's over in Canada. Later, I lived in Seneca, Missouri, and I rode my bike into Oklahoma. That wasn't a big deal because it was only a mile from my house. Another boundary that I always found interesting is the time zone. I was fortunate enough to have taught high school history at Sunbright, Tennessee. That's located on the Cumberland Plateau. The school, which was in the Eastern Time Zone, was just a 20-minute drive from the Central Time Zone line. One of my students lived in the Central Time Zone, and his girlfriend lived in the Eastern Time Zone. He got in trouble on more than one occasion for taking his girlfriend home past her curfew. Boundaries for counties, states, and property lines make sense, but why do we have time zone boundaries? In 1764, John Harrison, an Englishman who made a living as a horologist, that's a person who keeps time, made a discovery that helped the shipping industry. He found that by using clocks, he could locate ships at sea. Harrison received a handsome stipend from the British government, which in 1804 had passed the first of a series of longitude acts that were set up to reward anyone who could come up with a way to determine a ship's longitude. A ship's latitude was fairly easy to determine because of the solar angle and the parallel distances that exist between lines of latitude. Despite its use in the maritime world, many places continued to use sundials. That wasn't much of a problem until railways were built in the mid-1800s, especially in the United States. Can you imagine the problems that might be caused if it was 9 a.m. in Leadville, Colorado, 9:15 in Creede, Colorado, and 10 a.m. in Gunnison, Colorado? Well, without a coordinated time zone scheme, trains moving in different directions on that line could and would collide with each other. By having a standard or uniform time, train schedules could be made in such a way as to avoid collisions. Later on, when planes took to the air, standard times helped to ensure safer flight conditions over airports. In the 1880s, Great Britain was a global superpower, and it had already established its own standard time zones. At that time, it was said that the sun never set on the British Empire. In 1884, the International Meridian Conference was held in Washington, D.C. The conference adopted a 24-hour time zone configuration because that's how long it takes the Earth to rotate once on its axis. Longitudes or meridians, those vertical lines on a map or globe that measure east and west, were the obvious basis for where to place time zone boundaries. Since there are 360 degrees in a sphere, or the Earth, and it takes 24 hours for the Earth to rotate once, attendees at the conference decided that a time zone boundary would be placed every 15 degrees, moving east or west from the prime meridian, which the influential British were able to have run through their London borough, Greenwich, and so it was called Greenwich Mean Time. Because of prominent landscape features and cultural considerations, actual time zone boundaries sometimes crisscross the meridian and form all kinds of weird patterns. Also, for political reasons, not all countries signed up for GMT. France was prominent among the countries that refused to use GMT. However, In 1972, the name GMT was changed to Coordinated Universal Time, UTC. Without reference to an English borough, France adopted UTC in 1978. Despite the name change, 0 degrees longitude, or the Greenwich meridian, still sits at the middle of the 24-hour configuration. Still, some countries deviate from the 15-degree time zone boundary scheme. China, for example, only has one time zone. Some other countries use one time zone boundary plan, but they also have 30-minute and 45-minute lines as well. Important longitude lines include 0 degrees, that's the prime meridian or the Greenwich meridian, and 180 degrees west or east, that's the international date line. Note that longitude lines are drawn north and south, but they measure east and west. Latitude lines are drawn east and west, but they measure north and south. And you can tell which one is being discussed if it says, like, for example, 30 degrees in, that would be 30 degrees north, 30 degrees S, that would be 30 degrees south. And of course, if it's longitude, it would have the E or a W after the number. At any rate, because the Earth spins counterclockwise on its axis, time moves westward across the planet. Midnight is always somewhere on the Earth, but it moves in a predictable 24-hour cycle. For our purposes, we could state that time is later in the day in the east and earlier in the day in the west. Elk Creek Meadows, Colorado, which is where I live, is located at 105 degrees west longitude. By dividing that by 15, I come up with 7 time zones. So it's 7 hours difference between here and London. Of course, that would be later in the day in London, so at 5 p.m. here on Wednesday, it would be midnight on Thursday morning in London. At the end of the day, time zones are about trying to make each place on Earth better able to interact safely with other places. Planes and trains depend on a coordinated time zone to ensure safe travels. Time zones also help ensure that each place has similar daylight hours, and daylight savings time ensures that kids are not getting on buses in the dark.